I've always thought that lawyers are kind of like doctors in that like you don't know if you have a good doctor, you just know whether your doctor makes you feel like you have a good doctor.
Yeah, there you
It's
go.
very similar with lawyers, and I think what gives a client comfort is to hear somebody they trust tell them the thing that they should or shouldn't do, or how to navigate a particular issue.
Welcome, everybody, to our next episode of Beacon Voices. I'm your host, Akshay Verma. I am the COO at Spotdraft. Really excited today to have a conversation with the general counsel of a fantastic company named Tilt, Louis Shansky. Louis, welcome to the podcast. Really excited to kind of unfold our conversation. I was so impressed with our prep call. There's a lot of similarities that you and I have in our careers in lawyering and doing operational things. So I'm excited to dig into those areas. But let's get started with just who you are a little bit and kind of what you do at Tilt.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me on. I am general counsel at a company called Tilt. Tilt is a global FinTech that uses AI-powered cash flow underwriting to expand access to fair credit. So we have a suite of financial products that we offer in the U.S. We also have subsidiaries offering products in Mexico, the Philippines, and India, with aspirations to continue growing globally. And so I oversee the legal function, not only in the U.S. but across all our geographies as well.
And how big is the company in terms of employees, and how big is the legal function?
Globally, the company is around a little under 400, I think. And the legal team is currently 4 globally.
Okay.
I was going to say we have three lawyers in the U.S. and then 1 in the Philippines right now.
Okay. Got it. We'll dig more into kind of your role at Tilt and the company and the challenges that you're up against. But I'd love to start with just talking a little bit about your early career. And you're one of those rare lawyers who've done and seen a lot in that path. But I love this question because I get asked it all the time. People kind of look at my resume and they're like, "Wow, you've done this and this." What made you go to law school in the first place? And did you find what you were looking for there?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. I apparently, if you ask my parents when I was 10 years old, they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I told them that I wanted to go to DePaul Law School in Chicago, and I wanted to be a lawyer. And I have no memory of ever saying that, but I ended up going to DePaul Law School and becoming a lawyer. And it's kind of funny. I had gone to undergrad and started a punk rock band with some buddies that sort of took off at very small scale. And so when I graduated, we tried to do the band thing for a while. And
That's so
when
cool.
that, inevitably fizzled, I said, okay, what's next? And I sort of started like thinking about law school again. I think what attracted me to law school is I'm a very analytical and logical person. There's a very sort of appealing nature of that clean, logicking your way through a decision-making process or analytical process. And the law seemed like the neatest fit for that type of personality because, it's in theory how the law works. So decided to take the LSAT, did reasonably well, and ended up making the jump.
We're gonna have to. I somehow I missed this in our prep call. We're gonna have to talk about the punk band. We're gonna have to talk about the punk rock band for a little bit. Tell me about that. Like, what inspired that? Certainly, going on the road, being a musician, fame, and singing in front of crowds and playing in front of crowds. I'm sure is allure, but like, talk a little bit about that. Like, what part of you? Because I would argue that being a lawyer and being a punk rock star are like on two opposite ends of the spectrum when you think about careers. And you dabbled in both of them, and now you're incredibly successful lawyer. But tell me a little bit about that journey.
So I come from sort of a musical family. My dad is a classically trained pianist, and we're always had music playing in the house. When I was in high school, I sort of, got into punk rock through a friend of mine and, picked up the guitar. The great thing about punk rock is you don't have to be particularly skilled as a musician to play it. So, you learn a couple chords on electric guitar and, you can
Yeah.
play like half of the punk albums that are out there. And, just started making noise, with some buddies in a basement, and that turned into, playing a couple house shows when I was in college, and then that turned into playing some local clubs, and that turned into playing, some nearby cities, and that turned into getting offered a very small record contract, recording an album, and then we did some touring, three guys in a very old van, driving, for days on end, coast to coast a couple times.
Wow.
And it was a lot of fun. We met a lot of people, saw a lot of things that we never would have seen otherwise. Got to play our music in front of, thousands of people, over the course of our career. It was a great time. It was not particularly lucrative. It's the classic, like, you're making enough money at the
Starving
show to
artist.
pay for your gas to get to the next show, kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah.
But it was great. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and would never have given up those years. I think that was one of those like unique formative experiences that not a lot of folks are fortunate enough to get.
No, and it's just so your point around learning a few chords for punk rock actually resonate. I just picked up guitar about a year ago, and it was one of those things for me where it's like, I'm probably, I don't know, a little closer to retirement than I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so for me, there's a big drive to learn new things and keep your mind, growing and all of that. And so I picked it up, and my guitar teacher was very, very adamant. He said, I want you to learn on the acoustic first, and you're going to learn chords, and you're going to learn and it's going to be really hard. It's going to be really, really hard for you. And if we get through that, and if you stick with it he's like, give me 6 to 8 months, then I will allow you to play the electric guitar, and then you will see how much easier and more fun guitar playing can be. So we are just now starting songs from the Nirvana age and some of the others. I just learned a Cars song all the way through, which is like 6 chords. They're all power chords, and I
Yep.
can play the whole song all the way through, and it's a lot of fun. But that one particular comment around, being able to pick it up really resonated. And here's the other thing. I mean, this is not a garage band story for you. Like, you guys were on the road a little bit, and you were really learning and kind of being out there. Um, I'll ask you this one follow up, and then I'll move away from punk rock playing. But what was your biggest learning lesson from that experience that helped you in terms of being a lawyer? And you can obviously say that you can answer this with the benefit of hindsight.
I think I don't even know if it's like strictly speaking a lesson as a lawyer, although definitely has some applicability in an in-house context. Is just planning and logistics. In one of the things about playing in punk rock at the time, at least, wasn't quite as big as it got. Eventually, is you play a lot of like small clubs and basement shows where you'd walk in and somebody would realize like there's no microphone. They have a PA set up, but there's no microphone, or or the inverse, right? There's no speakers, or somebody forgot to bring the cables for everything, and taking it a step further, like on the band's end, having to plan for, hey, how are we going to get from A to B? Do we have enough time? Or can we fit all our equipment? If we need to bring our own PA for this show, does that fit in, the van? You have enough like missteps where you show up and things aren't thought of, that you realize the importance of like thinking about the details and the planning. And so in circumstances where I've been in-house and, like, for example, we're talking about launching a new product, I'm usually the one in the room saying, okay, so that sounds great on paper, but like, how are we actually going to do this thing? Like, a consumer wants to
Yeah.
use this feature. Like, how's that going to work on the back end? Is that going to be manual? Who's going to be pushing the buttons? Is it going to be automated? So that's definitely keyed a lot of like forward thinking instincts that I have.
Has to be operational in nature, and we'll get into this a little bit as well. It's just how much more operational today's in-house lawyer needs to be than even just a few years ago. Like, it's such a demand of the job and the role, and certainly legal operations and legal technology play a significant role in that, but we'll get to that in just a minute. All right, so you gave up your punk rock days. I'm sure you still play, I'm sure you still dabble. It's so much, the music is so fun. But you go to law school, you come out. What are you thinking at this point? Like, are you thinking I am going to big law and I'm going to go make partner? Are you thinking this is a stepping stone, something else? Like, what's your thought process? Like, is there one?
I was thinking I need a job.
Yeah,
So, I went to law school because of the band years. I went to law school, a few years later than a lot of folks do. And so, I graduated when I was 30 years old with, six figures in law school debt. And I just knew I need to be able, at minimum, I need to be able to like pay my student loans. Right. And everything else we'll figure out after. And um, I had a very tough time finding a job. I did very well in law school, but for whatever reason, I probably sent out about 100 resumes between the sometime in my second year and when I eventually got a job.
yeah,
And so I was ready to do anything, like any place that would have me. And so when I got an opportunity to interview at Mayor Brown, they were hiring for their structured finance securitization practice, and the recruiter called me up and said, hey, we saw your resume. I think I'd applied for a spot in the corporate group, and they said, we actually, we don't need anybody in corporate, but we do need somebody in securitization. Would you be interested in interviewing for that role? And I said, absolutely. And then I got off the phone and I Googled securitization. I had no idea what it even meant, but didn't matter. I was, just looking for a place to land at that point.
very cool. And where did you end up landing?
I ended up landing in Mayor Brown's securitization group. And I ended up landing there in the fall of 2007, which, if you remember your history, is sort of an interesting time to have been entering a capital markets centered
Yeah,
practice.
yeah. I mean, I'd go so far as to say anything related to banking globally, real estate markets,
Yep.
capital markets, and all the legal support that goes along with that, which tended to, for the most part, go to these very large firms. Did you know there was a tidal wave that was going to hit the financial markets? Like, did you have a sense of that at all?
I was so unsophisticated at the time. Like, I'd read the headlines about rising, mortgage delinquencies and, some of the early warning signs that banks were calling out. But I don't think I really like put two and two together that, if there's this like massive impact on credit and balance sheets of banks, like what that's going to mean for a securitization program at any of the major issuers, and what that's going to do to the market for those securities.
Yeah.
um and in this sort of naive way, I thought, well, they wouldn't have hired me, if 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 they thought there was going to be some massive dry up in the market, right? So
Of
that
course not. No,
everything's
they
gonna
never
be
do that.
fine.
Yeah. Yeah. You actually raise a really interesting point. So I graduated in 2006, so it's just a year before you. And my first job was at Pillsbury in the environmental group. I got an offer letter in March, April of 2006, which had a very nice number and a base salary associated with it. And then within about 3 months, so this must have been during the time that I was studying for the bar, um, I got another offer letter where the baseline had been increased by 10K. And I had no idea what was going on. But already this kind of race for talent in these big law firms had started.
Oh yeah.
And I remember feeling a little bit like, wait a minute, like, I obviously am very happy with my initial offer, like so excited. I've never made this kind of money before. I'm so excited to do this. And this firm, which has thousands of associates, is going to be increasing their pays significantly. I was like, can they afford this? I had no idea what law firm revenues were like. I didn't know any of those kinds of things, but I do remember having that feeling. Um, and then so I started, October of 2006. In December, they went up, or maybe it was January, February. They went up 10K again because one firm, and I can't remember which firm it was, had decided that in order for that firm to fight for the top talent, they had to pay a little bit more than everybody else. And so all of a sudden, you just had this race to the top. I'm not going to call it a race to the bottom, but you had this race to the top. And within a year, actually less than that, within 6 months of my start date, my starting salary had already increased by 20K, and I hadn't even learned how to be a lawyer yet.
Oh yeah.
So
That
we
was,
were really kind of like, okay, the junior associates were like, what's going on? Like, where is this? I had no clue. I had even less of a clue in my practice, which was an environmental practice, about capital markets or the real estate bubble or anything like that than you did.
yeah. Now those were, I mean, maybe it still is, but those were wild times at the big firms. I think I got a $15,000 raise. I signed my offer letter in like June or July. I think it was July, and I started that September, and I got a $15,000 raise in between those two events. So by the time I started, I was already making 15K more. It was kind of nutty.
Yeah. I mean, especially in your first couple of years of practice, it's so easy to move firms. And, if an associate's like, oh, this firm's offering me 15K more, you've got six-figure law school debt. I'm going
Yeah,
to be like, yeah, I'll go there. It's the same work. Let's all be honest. I'm going to be doing the same work. Maybe I even like the people more. I don't know.
yeah.
But it was an interesting dynamic that okay. Then, 2008 happens. What are you thinking? Like, how are things flowing around you? What's that like at Mayor Brown in the late fall, early winter of 2008?
I mean, it was actually prior to then because I think the the activity in the mortgage markets and the securities, mortgage backed securities that were starting to show those indicators. I think that kind of started to spook the capital markets sooner than you saw the big headlines, and so um, I this might be like a slight exaggeration, but I'm not sure I billed a single hour in that stub when I started in September through the end of 2007. I don't think I'd billed a single hour.
Wow.
I think I shadowed one securitization that was, going on at the time, and, might have like reviewed a closing list or something like that. But, there was no deal work, or very little. I sort of spent most of my days just like doing voluntary CLEs and trying to do some proactive reading about securitization, so I would not be a complete novice when I actually got billable work to do. Um, but by the end of the year, I'm like leaving the office at like 5 o'clock every day, and I'm only even staying that long because I don't want to be the guy who leaves too early. But by the end of the year, I was like, okay, this is weird. Like, feels like feels like I should be doing something. And then, I think the messaging around what was happening became a little more clear and overt, like into I call it the spring of 2008. And so there were still some deals going on, but most of them were non-US deals, and so they weren't really coming to our group or to my group. And quickly, what we began to be asked to spend time on were actually diligence projects. And so you'd have a bank that had big portfolio of CDO
Yep.
exposure or MBS exposure, and they'd want to know like, hey, when can I call a default? What are my rights when I call a default? What are the threshold, the performance thresholds that can trigger a default? And so, in an effort to just do something, I kind of raised my hand and said, hey, if there's anything I can do. And they said, well, actually, do you want to start coordinating this massive diligence effort for one of the banks that had all these CDOs. And so I'd say there were a couple projects like that. I'd say most of the billable work I did in 2008 was of that nature. It was not active deal work. It was just sort of deal document analysis
Yep.
for various banks that were trying to figure out what would happen if it all hit the fan, when it all hit the fan, kind of thing.
All right, but you survived. Like many of us, I mean, there were many of my colleagues and friends who unfortunately did not. They were laid off with the massive layoffs that kind of cascaded down from the banks going under to the law firms, because many law firms had large practice areas and lawyers and partners dedicated to that work. And if that work is gone, it's tough to survive that. But you
Yeah.
did, and you came out on the backside of that. And so, what was that survivor feeling like? And did it change the way that you were thinking about being a lawyer?
Yeah, I mean, during that period, I think to your point, I think that fall, if my timing is right, the fall of 2008, I think Mayor Brown laid off 33 associates in the structured finance group.
Wow,
Um,
one group.
and yeah, just in structured finance. Yeah.
Wow.
And, this is Mayor Brown is a massive structured
Yep.
finance practice. They're one of the,
Yep.
leaders there. And so they were shedding a lot of people. I think, they'd started to lay off like a few members of my starting class. Once they hit that 1 year mark, everybody was, everybody's on the table. And it really was keep me away from the chopping block. I'll do anything. I'll do anything. And so there was a lot of, like I said, diligence work, but I would also volunteer to help other groups. Like our tax controversy group would have big document review projects that they needed help with. I'd say, hey, I've got time, if you need another body.
Yeah.
Because it really was about just like staying busy, like doing whatever you could to stay busy. And then by, I don't know, maybe like the spring of 2009, things had started to, obviously we were, still amidst the recession, but the capital markets had started to show signs of opening up, at least for some of the well-known kind of blue chip ABS issuers, Capital Ones and Citibanks, and the folks who would securitize their consumer receivables. And so, but what had happened was, number one, we'd laid off a bunch of the junior associates in the group. Number two, at that time, law firms were deferring their starting classes. So I don't think there was a class of 2009. And so you're left with like a handful of associates, myself included, junior associates, who are available, to do the junior associate work on these very paper intensive deals. And no class immediately behind me, to sort of compete with. And so it sort of created a moat where, I was one of a few people left in the group who was available to do the deals. And that was the case for a year and a half to 2 years.
Yeah.
And so it gave me a good head start to not only like learn the deals, but build relationships with the clients, and sort of get sticky, in those spaces, so that, I became a third, fourth year lawyer. Like I had client relationships and I had, a niche that I'd carved out for myself. And I think that was very important, and a sort of lucky break. It's sort of a theme throughout my career. I think, better to be lucky than good, um,
Absolutely.
and I think that, being around, being the one who had hung on, when people were getting, shucked left and right, actually put me in a, very fortunate position when deals started to flow again, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And so at this point, are you thinking, yes, it's time for me to kind of stick it out here and make partner? Anything else kind of going through your mind in terms of where you're going to take your career and why?
No, I mean, at the time, I think that was very much my mentality. I enjoyed the practice. I enjoyed the clients. I worked on a bunch of very interesting deals, and I was successful at it. It seemed to be doing a good job. People liked me, the clients liked me, and so yeah, it seemed natural that I would continue on that path, and until I made partner or didn't. Right?
Yeah.
It's up or out at the big firms. So I
Yep.
figured I'd ride that out for my 7 years or whatever it is, and then see what happens.
Yeah. I wonder if it's still a 7-year journey. My guess is it's quite a bit longer now. But you did. You went and you became partner at Mayer Brown, and yet you are not still a partner at Mayer Brown. You are general counsel at Tilt. In fact, this is your fourth or fifth, or maybe even more, in-house roles. Um, Many, if not everyone, who goes into the law firm world intentionally sees making partner as kind of one of the ultimate goals in lawyering. And yet you decided at some point after becoming partner that it was no longer going to be for you and that you were going to try the in-house world. Talk to us a little bit about that decision making process. What really drew you into that? What about the law firm life made you say, thanks but no thanks? I've seen this all, and it's not at all what I thought it was going to be, or it's exactly what I thought it was going to be, but I'm not going to go forward. Like, tell us a little about that story.
Sure. I think um so I've never been, maybe a slight digression, but I've never been somebody for whom like money or financial reward is the primary motivator. And so, it's always about enjoying the way that I'm spending my days. If I'm doing a job, I want to enjoy it. I want to enjoy the people that I work with. I want to enjoy what I'm doing. I want to find it stimulating and engaging. And that was very much the case as an associate at Mayer Brown doing deal work, right? But what happens when you become a partner is that that shift between being a like a deal worker and a true lawyer versus suddenly becoming a revenue generator and a
Yeah,
business developer. Um, becomes very important because as you escalate through the ranks of partnership, it's not quite an eat what you kill model at most of the big firms, but there's a few degrees away from that. And so there's very much an expectation that you're going to go out and do pitches, and you're going to take clients to dinner, and you're going to do presentations, and you're going to write articles, and you're going to do all these things that are not the thing that you just spent the first 7 years of your career doing. They're really focused more on business development. And then, others kind of ancillary law firm related tasks like, mentoring junior associates, engaging in recruiting, and engaging with summer associates. All the big firms love to have young partners to trot out, to the summer associate classes so they can, feel kind of hip and cool. Um, and so what ended up happening is I found myself like a couple of years into partnership spending, 50% of my time doing real lawyering and 50% of my time doing all this other stuff and firm
yeah,
administration stuff. And it just wasn't fun for me. It wasn't what I enjoyed. And I think, so that was like, my first inkling that, maybe this wasn't for me. And I didn't know whether that was the product of being at a big firm or, product of being a partner altogether. But I think the other thing that started to become apparent to me is, I'd had a handful of ABS issuer clients that I'd been working with for years. I did a lot of work in auto loan securitization. So I worked a lot with the, Nissans and Volkswagens and, so and so of the world. And I really loved those clients. I'd had good relationships with the people at those companies. But what would happen is, they'd call you up and say, hey, we're going to do a deal. This here's our timeline. And you draft the documents and you negotiate the documents, and, you launch the deal and you close the deal. And then the client disappears, for 4 to 6 months. And then they come back with the next deal. But like, they're telling you all this stuff that has happened to them between the last deal and this one. and it's this very transactional relationship you have
Yeah.
with the company, where you help them do this very significant thing in their kind of growth trajectory, and then you don't get to see what happens as a result of it. You don't get to see how they figured out how to comply with the covenants, or how the deal is performing, or why they're making these changes between deal A and deal B. And so there's something like a little bit unsatisfying about just getting these glimpses. And I thought, well, it'd sort of be fun to be there. It'd sort of be
Yeah.
fun to, like see how this deal fits into running their business, and, how they're evolving, year over year. And so those two insights together, I think, led me to start thinking about going in-house.
Okay. And where did you step in first? What was your, was it intentional? Was it something that came across your desk? Was it a client who said, "Hey, Louis, come on in. Like, we need you here, and can you step into these shoes and help us run from the company from the inside?"
Again, better to be lucky than good. So
Yeah.
I think I had maybe applied for one in-house role, but it was sort of half-hearted. I wasn't convinced that that's what I wanted to do. I sort of, I'll put a resume and see what happens, and nothing happened. And then one day I got a just random LinkedIn message from one of the co-founders of a company called Upgrade. They're a FinTech lending platform. And they were nothing at that point. And the co-founder had said, "Hey, um, I ran capital markets at Lending Club for a number of years. I am co-founding a new company with Renaud Laplanche, who's been the founder of Lending Club and a couple other Lending Club vets. It's going to be a capital markets sort of dependent company. And so we need some in-house capital markets expertise. I got your name from, a mutual acquaintance. Would you be interested in talking to us?" And I think what made it intriguing was, number one, in-house opportunity. Number two, like, this was 2017. This is like right in the thick of, seeing tech companies explode, and
Yeah.
all these fintechs going public. Lending Club had gone public, a few others had gone public, and I thought, this is like the ground floor of maybe the next multi-billion-dollar company, and they need this niche skill that I happen to have. Right? It's a very because that's the thing, which maybe we can talk about at some point, is when you go in house, I think the skill set, the expectation of your skill set is often more broad than like having this particular expertise
True.
that a lot of law
Very
firm
true.
lawyers do.
Yep.
And so there is some. It can be a little bit intimidating to think, oh, geez, I'm a securitization lawyer, and now I'm going to become a general counsel somewhere. Like that leap can be intimidating. And so the idea that I wouldn't really be expected to do much that I couldn't already do, it sort of made it a no-brainer
Yeah.
when that opportunity came along.
Yeah. Look, I think in addition to kind of the specific issue of your level, your type, level, and depth of expertise as an outside counsel, the transition just on that issue going in house is difficult. But there's also a reason that many outside lawyers do not succeed in house. There's a mental shift that goes along with transitioning to the in-house world. There's a way of operating, there's a way of thinking, there's a recalibration of the concept of risk, and looking at things from a business perspective more than anything else, rather than really kind of putting your lawyer hat on and diving deep into a legal issue. And it sounds like you navigated that pretty well. A, would you agree with that statement? Like, is that something that you would agree with? And B, if that was a challenge for you, how did you overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll leave to others to say whether I navigated it well, but navigate it, I did, one way or the other. And I think there's a steep learning curve, right? Because I think what happens at a law firm, for most law firm lawyers, your sort of convention is to give like the academically correct answer or advice. Like, well, the law says this, so you can't do A, you must do B. And sometimes when you're in house, you say that to your colleague, on the business side, and they go, we literally cannot do B. Like, it's not, we have no way of doing B.
Yeah.
So you gotta tell me something else.
Yeah.
And you have to learn to then like risk adjust your advice at that point, right? Because you have to sort of understand the business. You have to understand like how the different aspects of the business function, what they can and can't do, what things are important to them, and what things they don't really care about. And then you have to figure out for that specific issue, like, how big of a fire is it if we get this wrong? Is this just an annoyance that we'll have to clean up in a few months? Or is this like, an existential threat if we get it wrong?
Yeah.
And you have to quickly calibrate on where do you, sort of put up a stink and say, no, we got to figure out how to do B, versus saying, okay, we can't do B. Let's do like, A minus, somewhere close to B, and see if we can create like the best story around why we're doing not quite B. But it's took a couple months and a few exchanges with my business partners at Upgrade, I think, to get to that point where I could give the cliche term actionable advice, practical actionable advice to
Well, I mean,
my
it has to be
colleagues.
actionable. Otherwise, on paper, it's really not going to help anybody.
Yeah. But but yeah, no, it was definitely a learning curve. And I think, what helped me out a lot was I was fortunate to be surrounded by experienced business operators. The team had come from another successful company, had similar model. They knew like what they could and couldn't do largely. So it wasn't like, I was presented with, wild scenarios of, something crazy they wanted to do. It was usually matters of degree and saying, okay, well, yeah, I think we can get there if we do it this slightly different way. And but yeah, there was a lot of iterating, in those first few projects I did with them, for sure.
Yeah. Like, being in house is monumentally different, obviously, for a variety of different reasons. I'd like to focus in on two of them for the next part of our conversation. The first one is around people. Would love to get your thoughts around what you think works well with legal teams, what you look for as you think about building out legal teams, and kind of a little bit of your thought process on that. And then we'll switch gears after that to talk a little bit about the role of legal operations and legal technology in your in-house world. Like, let's start with that. But let's start with the people side first. And you get into your first in-house role. I'm not sure if you got a chance to build out the legal team in some fashion or not, but like, how do you think about those things as an in-house lawyer?
So, it, sort of in typical lawyer fashion, I'm going to answer your question about building a team by starting with talking about myself. The I I always, to that first comment about joining Upgrade, I always find like when I'm looking at any job opportunity, I always think about what expertise do I have today that will be applicable and useful in this new role, because I never want to walk into a role where everything is foreign and I'm learning, every aspect of my job on the job, right? Um, I don't think it brings much value to a role like that, number one. But number two, from a confidence perspective, I think it helps with your self-confidence to come in saying, hey, this thing I'm going to be doing, I know cold. And you can ask me
Yeah,
any question about capital markets, securitization, and I'm going to nail it. And so, number one, that helps me sort of continue to feel like I'm a good lawyer, I can do this. And number two, it gives me some credibility with the team for those moments where I say, I actually don't know, this area of the law. I need a minute to like go get smart before I give you an answer. And so that's been sort of like a guiding principle for roles that I've considered taking. So what does that have to do with building a team? That is also a guiding principle for how I build teams. And what I mean by that is, at a startup in particular, you don't have the resources to hire like subject matter expert for every area of the business. You can't walk in on day one Series A company and say, okay, I'm going to need a corporate lawyer, an HR
Yep.
lawyer, regulatory lawyer, da da da. They're going to say
Nor
no.
nor would you get one even if you asked for it.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to say, you get one, you get one lawyer, figure out who you want. And so the first thing I do, in that context is make sure I have a very strong understanding of the business. Like I think the first step to building a team is you have to really thoroughly understand the business you're in, where the legal issues come from, and which ones are the most important ones. So I've spent a lot of my time at consumer financial services companies, so that means a very heavy focus on consumer protection law, making sure that from a product perspective, like giving the right disclosures, presenting things in a clear and transparent way. Operationally, we're handling consumer accounts the way that they expect them to be handled. And so that's like a critical aspect of that business, that sort of business. And so you start with something like that and you say, okay, so I need the consumer regulatory side to be covered. And there's going to be more legal work to do than just, consumer finance.
Yep.
But who do I hire? You don't hire somebody who has no experience in consumer finance. You need somebody who feels like they can do that piece of the job very well, right? Who, so has some experience and expertise, and who you think has enough of a nimble mind that if you say, hey, by the way, here's a commercial agreement that needs reviewed, or
Yep.
there's a random HR issue that the people team needs help with, that they can flex into it and not be intimidated by it, and get up to speed relatively quickly. And so um sort of expanding on that, like if you cover off like the most important aspect of your business, so for us, consumer protection, then you go, well, what else is there that drives a lot of risk and legal work? And so maybe depending on the business, that's capital markets, or maybe it's on the commercial side, maybe you have a lot of partnerships that you're constantly negotiating. But I take that same lens as I sort of stack rank the needs. Okay, we got consumer finance covered. Next issue we need covered is capital markets. So I want somebody who can do capital markets plus, and I'm going to expect them to do some more things, but I want them to come in with this core competency that they're going to be able to exercise on a daily basis while flexing into some other things.
Yeah.
And I just sort of keep, adding to the team on that principle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think the thing that I'm hearing from you on that is that it's not just the lawyer, but the person.
Yeah.
I don't know if I stick to this 100% of the time, but to me, irrespective of the kind of role that I'm looking at hiring for, lawyer, legal professional, something else, I think resilience and growth mindset set you up for success. To your point, particularly as a lawyer, if you're brought in to do capital markets work or structured finance, you should have some experience in those areas. I think that's probably table stakes. But then, especially in the in-house world, having the ability, the mental curiosity and drive to learn new things, which are going to be needed. I mean, everybody in-house needs to be a little bit of a privacy expert, a little bit of a privacy in this day and age.
Yep.
And we'll get to this part in a minute. AI, every lawyer and legal professional and really every human being on the planet is going to need to learn something about AI, how to use it, how it works, and things of that nature. So having that resilience and growth mindset, I think, are critical, irrespective of the kind of role that you're hiring for. And I think if you
Yeah.
can do that with the subject matter expertise to some level and depth being table stakes, I think you've set yourself up very nicely for whatever team that you're thinking about building. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit. So we've talked about the people side of the equation, but obviously operational expertise, operational know-how. Coming out of the financial crisis, as we were talking about earlier, one of the things that became incredibly different post 2010, I would say, was that in-house lawyers, GCs, CLOs no longer had the kind of carte blanche that they had pre 2008 to spend and hire the way that they wanted to. There were some significant screws that remain today that gave birth to the rise of legal operations to a great extent. And now, in the last 7 to 8 years, legal technology has played a prominent role in all of that. Talk to me a little bit and our listeners a little bit about the role that legal technology has played for you. And if to any extent you've dabbled in legal operations or worked with strong legal operators, would love to hear about that as well.
Um, so it's funny I've other than my brief stint at Robinhood when my last company was acquired, I've always been at relatively early stage startups where, to your point, legal headcount is, at premium, and, at at most of the places I've been, a dedicated like legal ops person has been, a non-starter. It's
Yep.
like,
Bit
no,
of a
we
luxury. Yep.
don't need a human to do that. That's just, rolling up your sleeves and, doing some of the grunt work yourself and da
Yep.
da da. And so I think like what's been important is to make the legal operations within the company as efficient as possible, and finding, tools and methods that enable that, right? And I would not characterize myself as somebody who has like aced it and figured out the perfect system. I think I'm always learning, and every company operates a little bit differently, and it forces you to tweak, the style of legal operations a little bit, right? Um, so I definitely think you have to be a little bit adaptive with it. You have to understand the context you're working in, how that business runs. Like, for example, my last two companies have been fully remote, which, obviously adds its own wrinkle to the operation
Absolutely.
side and coordination side. But it's definitely a puzzle. In terms of tooling, I think, to your point about AI, I think one of the most you know I've tried at different stops a variety of tools, on the operation side, on the contract management side, contract generation side. I think what's really intriguing right now, and you mentioned the buzzword of the year, AI, right? What's really intriguing right now is the number of new tools that are emerging that have like really fantastic potential use cases in legal operations, um, even though they're not necessarily designed with lawyers in mind, right? And so, when you think about um, platforms like that facilitate workflow automation, where you can say, hey, when a complaint hits my inbox, send it to Chat GPT to parse it and identify the claim and identify the name of the consumer making the claim, and then send that information to our database to pull the account records for that individual, and then send all of that back to an LLM to determine, based on the account history and the claim, like, does their claim have merit? Did we do what they say we did? And then produce a summary of the merits of the claim and the background, and then spit that back into my inbox as a memo.
Yeah.
And so, without ever touching the thing, you can have a summary of the complaint and its validity, and, any sort of bad facts that, you might have created in the handling of the account, or, but you can more quickly dispose of, like, triage and dispose of those things when they hit your inbox, without doing all of the intervening manual steps of like pulling the account data,
Yep.
looking at the customer support exchange history, and all that other stuff. And so I think things like that are really exciting. There are some places where it's not like quite there yet, but you can see the frameworks in which those things can be built. Um, and just streamline the legal function incredibly.
Yeah. Like as a profession, and to some extent, I have to blame law firms for this because that's where we were all trained, and that's where all legal work was done for so long before the in-house department was even created. So much manual effort goes into every little thing. You said something earlier in your deal days, that you worked on these incredibly large paper-intensive deals. Okay, now large law firms are particularly well suited to carry out that work because of their scale. So here's a spicy question for you. That has, to a great extent, been the bedrock and the foundational revenue generator for law firms for a long time. Large sorts of humans doing tasks that are billed out at exorbitant rates that I won't even get into in this one, but doing these big litigation matters and deals and things of that nature. AI has the potential to really change all of that for the one particular reason that we were just talking about, which is that there are so many manual tasks that are involved in doing a great portion of that work. Now, if those can be automated with some level of check, and let's say it works well, do you fundamentally see law firms changing the way that they deliver work, or do you see it going kind of business as usual? And I'll also remind our listeners that we're not talking to somebody who was a associate for 6 or 7 years. We're talking with somebody who went on to become a partner at Mayer Brown and fully understands the economics of the law firm model. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I'll give you a real life example. So our company rebranded earlier this year, and changed our name. And so, as you can imagine, on the consumer facing side, agreements, disclosures, terms, yada yada yada. We had probably 40 or 50 different consumer facing pieces of paper that needed to be updated just to change our name and a couple other details. And that's the sort of thing that a human would have had to sit down and go through each of them at some point. Today, it's possible for us to just take all those documents, upload them to an LLM, and say, in every instance of this phrase, replace it with this phrase. In every instance of this phone number, replace it with this phone number. Whatever other changes, spit them back out. Maybe a human eyeballs them or a sample of them to make sure it got it right. But that process happens in 15 minutes, right? Instead of the few hours it would take somebody to go through and do all that manually. And so now, whether you like it or not, that's possible, and clients know it's possible. And so if you're a law firm and you're generating, 60 documents for the latest securitization, of some repeat issuer, and most of what you're doing in those documents, I know this from experience, is updating the deal name and some dates and things like that, and you're charging, a dozen hours of associate time to
Yep.
do that, when I know full well an
Yeah.
LLM could do it in a matter of minutes, like you're just not going to keep the business for that long, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think law firms have to adapt
Yeah.
and have to find ways to themselves leverage that technology, because I do think there will continue to be a human element to lawyering, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
you know,
Yeah.
putting ethical and privilege issues to one side, which there are, when
Yeah.
it comes to using legal AI. I think there's, for the foreseeable future, always going to be a human element that the client is looking for. They want to hear somebody that they trust. It's an old analogy that is probably not perfect, but I've always thought that lawyers are kind of like doctors in that, like, you don't know if you have a good doctor. You just know whether your doctor makes you feel like you have a good doctor.
Yeah. There you
It's
go.
very similar with lawyers, and I think what gives a client comfort is to hear somebody they trust tell them the thing that they should or shouldn't do, or how to navigate a particular issue. And so that substantive advice giving, I think, is again, for the time being, is going to be a very human thing. But the more rote and mechanical tasks that law firms have traditionally done, they've got to find a way to make more efficient, to maintain that billing credibility.
Yeah,
And it also, I think, will help law firms emphasize the real value they do provide in that advisory context, if that makes sense.
absolutely. Like that's why we went to law school. That's the reason that we had law schools to become counselors, to provide our expertise and our judgment and our advice to our customers and our clients. By the way, I also want to point out in-house world, the in-house world is not immune to this whatsoever. You can see that they're
Standing
excited. The
visitor here.
dad's don't worry about it at all. Don't worry about it at all. The dad's on the podcast, but very true of the in-house world. So much manual work goes through, and this is why legal teams are really struggling. They really struggle with keeping up the pace for the business. Um, Almost, I don't know, 98% of legal teams in house are made up of lawyers who came from the law firm world. So until they get a feel for how they need to be more effective and efficient in house and automate tasks, stop doing tasks by prioritizing them, things of that nature, which is not something that we are trained to do in the law firm world, it'll continue to be an issue there as well. All right.
Now,
Yeah, go ahead.
maybe
Okay.
just maybe one quick thought on that. I mean, in agreement. That's one of the things that I talked about with my team at our last onsite, and we brainstormed ways that we could use a full AI tooling to improve efficiency or automate tasks that we're currently doing manually. And then everybody sort of took ownership of an idea and has to sort of flesh it out, just
Fantastic.
and see if we can build it into something before our
Yeah.
next onsite. And so we just always want to be thinking about how to keep up. Exactly.
Yeah, little mini hackathon in legal always makes for good advice and for good outcomes. All right, I promised you at the beginning. I've got three questions that I'm probably going to be asking all of our guests. We'll see how they turn out over time. So here's the first question: what advice would you give to your law school self? So if you go back and talk to your law school self. Let's say I don't know. Let's say in your 3L year. Let's say you're almost to the end, and you're going to be able to give this advice, obviously, with the benefit of hindsight. What would that piece of advice be?
Um, I think I would probably just try to give myself better a better characterization of what's happening in law school. Everybody, the thing you always heard was, you don't go to law school to be a lawyer. You go to law school to learn how to think like a lawyer, and there's some truth to that. But the analogy I would use is like you're to put it into a cooking context. You're not going to law school to learn how to make food. You're going to learn techniques. You're going to learn knife skills and sauce skills and whatever else. But the way in which you apply those skills can vary wildly from what you learn and the contexts you see in law school, right? Law school is very litigation heavy context because you're generally reading case law.
Yep.
And it doesn't give you any context for the myriad paths that a lawyer can take. And so like I don't think something like securitization ever occurred to me in law school because law school doesn't teach you that sort of thing exists and the legal issues that go into structuring a deal and creating a bankruptcy remote entity, all these things. So I think just like having a better understanding of what I'm actually learning and what's important to take away from law school and what is really not necessarily what I'm going to see on the other side
Yep.
would have been helpful.
So would you reduce law school down to a year then?
Everybody's got a different take on this. I'll be blunt. Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
For me, I don't know that I added much to my skill set in my second or third years. I think the bulk of the Yeah, the analytical honing happened in that first year.
I think that's right. And then just like most other professions, you can do an apprenticeship and get your hands-on experience. Okay, shifting the audience of this advice to law students and maybe even early legal professionals today, would your advice change at all, or would it be the same?
Um, it's a good question. I think maybe the only as far as law school itself, maybe it'd be the same. But I think in general, um, what I would say to like young lawyers as an audience is stay open and stay nimble. There's a lot of different paths you can take. There's a lot of different contexts in which you can apply your skills. And they're all very, very different. The environments are very different. And there's sort of like I think for everybody, there's sort of like a magical set of circumstances that creates like a wonderful job for them. And you never know what that is unless you stay open to something else that might come along. Unless you feel like you've got your dream job, stay
Yeah,
open, stay nimble.
yeah, I like that one. All right, last question. Looking ahead for yourself 10 years from now, what's the kind of path that you hope you've taken, not just in title, but also in the kind of work that you do?
um 10 years, that's either not that long or a very long time, depending on your
Fair, fair.
depending on your
Yeah,
context. I think, I think that what I'd like to be doing, whether it's my full-time job or, just something I do on the side, um, I think that I enjoy mentoring and helping other lawyers, younger lawyers, find their way, navigate their careers, navigate situations that they come across in their jobs. And I'd love to have found a way to spend more meaningful time doing that, being a resource for younger lawyers in some
awesome.
capacity.
Yeah, I love it. I love the aspect of giving back to this profession that has given us so much. Louis, thank you so much for joining me today. For our listeners, a reminder: my guest today was Louis Shansky, General Counsel at Tilt, our newest Beacon Voice. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.